I'm doing something a little bit different in this video, and what I've done is compile pretty much all of my cabinet related videos, even including my very old ones, into one compilation video, creating the complete beginner's guide to building cabinets. You're gonna see how to build a base cabinet, an upper cabinet, how to create a shaker style door, a flat panel door, install undermount drawer slides, side mount drawer slides, install, level, and create a toe kick. And because it is so long, I will leave chapters down below so you can jump to any portion of the video that you would like. I'm going to be taking you through the steps of breaking down a full sheet of plywood and all of the steps that I go through to get all of those pieces ready to be assembled as a cabinet. First thing I want to show you is an idea of what it is exactly that I'll be building. We have an entire row of base cabinets down here. We have 1, 2, 3 that are going to be open up, have maybe an adjustable shelf, have a couple of doors, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4 that are going to have 3 drawers each. Now what I have here is just one sheet of my cut list. I use a program called Cut List Optimizer. I've talked about it in previous videos. But what's great about this is that this gives me an opportunity before I even start to know how I want to break down my sheets of plywood. It also tells me exactly how many sheets I'm going to need because each sheet is broken down. When I look at this, there is only one thing that I'm concerned with, and that is my rip cuts. Now, if you're wondering why I like to focus on ripping first, ripping is the very first step in the process. I want to rip every single sheet. So then that way, once I'm done ripping every single sheet, I can move on to the next step in the process. Rip it, full 8-foot long piece, and I'm gonna set it off to the side. Now, the first thing I like to do on any sheet of plywood is I like to rip off the edge of the plywood. I just take about 6 millimeters or so off. The reason why is because if you're gonna edge band these cabinets, that's not a good surface for you to apply your edge banding to. And in a lot of cases, depending on the edge banding you're using, especially if you're using very cheap and expensive edge banding, you're going to see that edge. So what am I doing? I am establishing a clean reference edge. Right now, we're gonna go through this process. So let me go ahead and make this cut, and then we'll move on to the next part. If you were able to be here and see the difference between this cut edge or this non-cut edge, the factory edge, and the cut edge, it's substantially different. Now, before I make any adjustments, one thing that I'm gonna do is I take a permanent marker and I just mark this edge, because this is my reference edge, with a black X, and that'll be important when we get into the next step. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna go ahead and adjust my parallel guides to the width that I need. So I need 726. This is where I'm gonna go just a little bit over that because my final pass will be over at the table saw. 726, we'll go with 730, and my track is in place, and now I can go ahead and make this next rip cut. The second step that I take is I actually go ahead and edge band all of my long ripped panels. I would rather do 7 long pieces than do 25 shorter pieces. And this is especially true if you're gonna be using press-on, if you're gonna be using iron-on, however you decide to apply it, all you have to do is ask yourself, how many times do you want to apply that? And the final reason is because now, if this already has the edge banding on it, when I cross-cut everything to make my panels the proper length that I want them to be, it cuts the edge banding super clean. So I don't have to worry about trimming a bunch of edges. I'm trimming it as I cut. Now, before I edge banded, I mentioned that I would always mark my cut edge, which for me is my reference edge on all subsequent cuts. I'd mark it with an X. Well, another one of the big reasons why I like edge banding these long strips right off the bat is because now I always know what my reference edge is because it's edge banded. So that is the thing that's always gonna go against the fence for all of my subsequent cuts, and I don't have to keep track of anything anymore. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and start cutting these down. And I know I'm gonna get 3 panels on each one of these long ripped pieces. What I like to do for my first cut, I'm gonna cut that one a little bit long. The reason I do that is because just like I took off the factory edge with my first cut, I need to do the same thing with the factory edge at the top or the bottom of the cabinet. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut this first piece. I'll move this off to the side. I'll flip this over. I'll cut it to its final length, and then every one after that just comes in, and the process just goes pretty quick. So we'll go ahead and flip this over. Put the stop down. I've got a little bit to cut off here, and let me just actually take this as an opportunity just to see. So I've got just under 5 millimeters here, and I've got just a little bit more than that at the top. Right now, that factory edge is not a square edge, so I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of that right now. This panel is now done. Time to move on to the other panels. The next step in my process is I go and I rip everything to the final width, whatever the depth of the cabinet would be. This doesn't take a lot of time, and the other thing too is the reason why I like doing it like this is because the very next step, I need all of the panels because I'm going to cut all of my grooves in all of my panels, the side panels and the bottom panel, and that will accept the back panel that is actually going to go inside of the cabinet. So while I'm here, I just go ahead and do both. So I'm going to go ahead and get everything ripped to the final width. Next, I'm going to go ahead and set up my table saw to cut the grooves. I'm using a 1/4 inch dado stack, 6 mil, and the way that I like to do my stretchers, which you'll see once I get to the assembly portion, is I like to use the material that I'm using for the stretchers, in this case the exact same plywood, and that's going to be my spacing. So I'm going to cut all of these grooves and we'll move on to the next step. I like to take this opportunity to punch any of my holes that I might need for shelf pins. Not only punch out my shelf pin holes, but also where my hinge plates are going to be, because typically I'll build frameless cabinets or use European style hinges. So this allows me the ability to do that now, so I don't have to try to worry about that after I get everything assembled. Now I do this not only for the shelf pin and hinge locations, but typically I will also pre-drill all of my hole locations for my drawer slides. And the advantage to that is that when I assemble this cabinet, everything is already there. From there, I can throw in all my hardware and not have to worry about jigs and spacers and pre-drilling and all of the things that make that process very difficult. All of my cabinet pieces are now completely done. The only thing left to do at this point is just put all of these boxes together. I've got a little secret for all of you. You don't have to use glue when building cabinets. So the first thing that I do, I place it on something that I know is flat. In this case, I'm placing it on my MFT, and I'm gonna move it kind of close out here to the edge. And I'm gonna take one of my sides, and I'm just gonna stand it up here like this. Now, what I'm trying to do is just make sure that the front is perfectly lined up. Once I know that front is perfectly lined up, I'm gonna start using my narrow crown stapler. You could use a brad nailer or anything else. What I'm trying to do at this point is not fully assemble the cabinet. I'm just trying to get it together so it doesn't fall apart. I wanna get everything lined up because I'm gonna go back with something else. So I'm using a narrow crown staple, and I'm just gonna go ahead and go away from the edge a little bit. Place one staple there. I know that that's lined up. I don't even need to check the back. I'm going to go to the back, make sure I'm applying downward pressure on that bottom just to make sure that it's nice and flat. I'm going to add another one back here, and then typically I'll go ahead and add one right around the middle. Now, as you can see, I can let that go. It's not super sturdy just yet. The reason why I like to use the narrow crown staple is I feel like it has substantially more holding power than a typical brad nail. Now what I'll do is I'll go ahead and spin this around, and I'll do the exact same thing with the other side. While I've still got this upright, the next piece that I like to add is this bottom stretcher or nailer, because it's actually going to be behind my panel when I add it, and that will actually be what I screw it into the wall with. I'll do the same exact thing to both sides, making sure that they're nice and flush. Now I want to point out that I'm only putting 2, and I'm actually putting them more towards the middle because I want to add a screw at the top and a screw at the bottom, and I'll show you all that here in just a minute. Now I'm going to go ahead and lay my cabinet to where it is on its back. I will take my next nailer and I will place it so it's nice and flush. You'll notice that it lines up perfectly with my groove. It's directly behind where I'm going to slide the panel in once it's all assembled. From there, I'll go ahead and tip it up. Next thing I want to do is go ahead and put my top stretcher with my edge banding out towards me. Make sure everything is nice and lined up, and I'll follow the same steps. Finally, I'm going to lay it down flat, turn it back up towards me, and I'm going to put my stretcher that goes across the top and actually is directly in front of where I'll slide the panel into. Next, I just like to lay out some lines on all the areas that I'm going to be drilling holes for my screws, and I want to go 3/8 of an inch. And it's not needed, you could eyeball it, but uniformity is just nice in my opinion. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a line there. This doesn't have to be really fancy because in most cases the sides of these cabinets are going to be not visible. So we'll go ahead and mark it right there. I'll do the same thing on the bottom. Same thing across here. And now I have a guide for my screws just to make sure everything looks nice and neat. What I'm going to use here is a countersink drill bit so I can make sure that the screw heads are exposed. Depending on the screws you use, you don't necessarily need to pre-drill. I just like to pre-drill. It works and it gives me a little bit cleaner result. Now on the stretchers, I'm going to put 2. I'm going to put 1 out more towards each end. Across the bottom, I'll put a total of 4, 1 in the back, 1 in the front, and then 1 in between where the existing crown staples are. Then I'll go ahead and pre-position all of my screws. The screw length that I like to use is 1.5 inches, and so what I'll do is I'll just go around, I'll tighten all these up. Now that side's done, I'll spin it around and I'll do the same thing on the other side. The last thing that I like to do is go ahead and attach this bottom panel from underneath to the stretcher just in a couple of places, and I follow the exact same step as before. I just draw a quick reference line at 3/8 of an inch, so I'm splitting the material, and then I'm going to go ahead and just drill 3 holes. Prep my screws. Go ahead and lift this back up. We'll do a quick check for square, even though in all actuality it doesn't matter too much at this point. But I've got a nice square cabinet. Now, I say it wouldn't really matter that much if it wasn't perfectly square at this point, because when I go to install these, whatever my base cabinet is, that's my starting point, I'll do everything I can do to make sure that that is square, and then I'll build off of that. As you can see, I just put this cabinet together in a matter of a couple of minutes. I didn't use any glue, I didn't use any clamps, and I didn't use any domino or biscuits or anything like that. Now, while there are some advantages to using dominoes or biscuits, because it'll just help get everything aligned very quickly, it just really, in most cases, isn't totally necessary. Now, the only thing we have left to do is put in the back panel, and this cabinet is done. Once that's in, the final thing that I'll do is I'll just run a couple of narrow crown staples just in the back, just to keep that in place. And there we have it. We have a strong, sturdy cabinet, and just build it like this. It's going to save you a lot of time, it's going to save you a lot of headaches, and it's going to be a lot. I'm Jason Bent, welcome back to the channel, and in today's video, I'm going to walk you through step by step how to make a frameless cabinet with a full overlay door. We'll go over the carcass construction as well as the hinge and door installation. So when we're talking about cabinets, there's really two specific types of cabinets that come to mind and have different variations. You have a frameless cabinet, and then you have one with a face frame. Now, there's pros and cons to both of those, and it depends on what kind of look you're going for. With a face frame application, you're gonna have much larger reveals, and with a frameless application, you're gonna have much thinner, cleaner reveals. Now, when it comes to frameless cabinets, which is what you see here, you typically are gonna have your full overlay, or some sort of overlay, and then you're gonna have inset. And inset, obviously there's no overlay because the drawers and door fronts are even with the front of the cabinet. And that is the design that I went with on my miter saw station. Now, this example is a frameless full overlay, and that's what we're gonna be talking about today. We're gonna start by identifying some of the different pieces that we're gonna be using. For this video, I actually have all of my pieces cut with the exception of a couple I'll talk about here in just a minute. So starting from my left, we have the two side panels, we have the top and bottom, we have what will be an adjustable shelf, we have a couple of nailers, and then I have my material, which is going to be my back panel, and then I have my material, which is going to be the door. Let's quickly go over some common sizes that you're going to find with a traditional upper cabinet. Typically, upper cabinets are going to be anywhere from about the 30-inch range to the 42-inch range if it's a single standalone cabinet. And then things can vary based on, let's say you want to build a 30-inch and then you want to build like a 12-inch separate cabinet above it for additional storage or something like that. The common depths that you're going to find with upper cabinets is 12 inches to 24 inches. And then some of the common widths that you're going to find are anywhere from 9 to 12 inches all the way up to 36 inches. With all that being said, the example that I'm making in this video is actually a 30-inch tall cabinet. It is 12 inches deep and it is 18 inches wide. So because I already have my top, bottom, and sides cut, the first step that we're going to do is actually go ahead and cut the groove that's going to accept the panel. So let's start walking through that process. Before I get into showing you the layout that we're going to do for the grooves, I wanted to highlight something here. And so this is the exact same piece of plywood. It's just this side is one side and this side is the other. And so something that I'm always looking for, especially in an application like this where I want the inside of my cabinet to look nicer, I would select this to be the interior portion of the cabinet and this to be the exterior portion, since this is not going to be seen. So I need to make sure that I account for that when I'm figuring out where I want my grooves to be, because one groove will need to be at the back of the cabinet here, the other groove will need to be at the back of the cabinet here. So just something to pay attention to. And the same thing applies to the top and bottom. I obviously want the top and bottom to match the look of the sides, so I need to identify what those faces are. Okay, so right now I'm looking at the two cabinet sides. I've got the backs facing inward because, again, I need to make sure that the grooves are in the back of the panel. And so something that we want to be aware of is that we're going to have nailers in the back. And these nailers are going to be there to give my screw something to go through and drill into the studs and provide a little bit of extra support. So with that being said, if I was to bring it over here, I want to make sure that this is flush with the end because my groove needs to start here. And when it starts here, I need to make sure it's the proper thickness for the panel that I'm going to use, which in this case is a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter plywood. And then that way I can start my cut, and when I go to put everything together, this will actually fit in right behind it and be perfectly flush with the back of the cabinet. I'm not using anything special. I'm actually just going to use a single full kerf blade and just creep up on the fit, because 1/4 inch plywood is not 1/4 of an inch. So it's a lot easier for me to do it this way. But the way that I'm going to get that spacing is I'm just going to use the material that is going to be behind it to set the spacing of my fence. That way I know that I'm setting it perfectly right off the bat. And once I get it set, I should be able to just drop it down, nice snug fit, but not too tight. And now I know that when I make my first cut, I'm going to move the fence over and it'll allow enough space for this board. So the next step is going to be setting the height. Now, when setting the height, I like to use setup blocks. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. You can use the material itself, but for me, I just find the setup blocks the easiest. So it looks like that's my highest point. So I'm going to bring my blade down just a little bit, and it looks like now I'm perfectly flush. Now, the depth that I like to go is 8 millimeters on 18 millimeter ply, 8 to 10 millimeters, somewhere around the halfway mark. This is an 8 millimeter setup block. So once I have this set, we're good to go. So one thing that I like to do is actually bring my material over to the table saw and actually lay everything face down so I can basically take it, just so you don't get mixed up, and I can run it through and I know everything is good to go. And while I'm doing this, you'll notice that because I want the clean side to be on the interior, that's where I need to cut, so I'm looking at the non-clean side. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and make my first pass on all of these. Now, this last piece that you saw me just cut, this is just a scrap of the same material that I'm using for the cabinet. And the reason I did this is because now that I've made my first pass, I'm going to go ahead and start to shift this over, and I want to creep up on the cut to where it is exactly the fit of the panel. And so, because I don't want to overshoot it, I just use this scrap. But now I can go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and move my fence over not quite 1/8 of an inch. Maybe about 1/16 of an inch or a couple millimeters, and I'm going to make another cut. All right, so now I can actually take this piece and test it before actually cutting the rest of my pieces. And what we're looking for is a nice snug fit, but not too tight. And that actually is really, really good. That's exactly what I want. I can move it around. It's not too hard to get on. Fits just fine. So now I can actually go ahead and make the cuts on everything else because the fence is already set. And here I'll bring you in close to show you what I was talking about with the nailer and having it be nice and flush to the back. Once I put that on there, that panel will not be inhibited by my nailers. Okay, so what's next? Before I mentioned this is an upper cabinet, and realistically you're probably going to have one, at least, probably two, shelves that are going to be in it. And something that I want to point out is I've already cut this prior to, because I knew what all my measurements were going to be. And something that I want to point out is when you're cutting your shelves, obviously they need to fall a little bit short of where that back panel is going to be, just to give you that flexibility. And then the other thing is that whatever the width of this bottom panel is, I usually will take off about 1/8 of an inch from the actual shelf, just so it's not tight in there. It gives you about 1/16 of an inch wiggle room on each side, or a couple millimeters. Now for this application, we're just going to put an adjustable shelf in the center, and this is 30 inches tall, so we're going to go 15 inches is the center. I'm going to go ahead and mark one at the front, really just for the demonstration. I'm going to mark one more towards the back, just kind of as a reference. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. We're just going to do 3 holes in the front and back on each panel just to make this go a little bit faster. Obviously, not everybody has an LR32 system from Festool to make this very simple. So there's other techniques that you can do. There's some great jigs on the market that you can add these holes. Me personally, I actually like to use my Woodpecker's TS rule, because these holes are actually spaced out 32 millimeters, which is a whole nother conversation we won't dive too deep into in this video. But something that you can do is you can kind of just use one of these as a reference. And as long as you know where your center hole is, so in this instance, this is going to be my center hole. So I'm just going to do these 3. And something that you can do is, since this already has holes in it and you're referencing off of the bottom of the board, as long as you do the same thing with each one, you know, you'll be fine. So this is actually a 5mm bit, which is the size of the shelf pin holes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the inside set of lines. I'm going to take this self-centering bit, push it down, make a mark, make a mark, make a mark. I'm going to slide it to the back, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other. Like I mentioned before, there are a lot of really nice jigs out there to make this a very simple process. I just don't have any of those jigs. And I'm trying to do this in a way that is a little bit more relatable. So, my hole, make my hole. Basically what this is doing is it's just ensuring that that pointed bit is going to be centered, and I have the same reference on both the front and the back. So now we're good to go. I'm just going to drill these out real quick with this same bit, and we'll move on to the next step. And this is just something that is helpful. It is by no means necessary. I want to create a reference line. So I know my plywood is 18mm thick. So I want to find a center line on that. So I'm going to use my rule, and I'm going to mark 9mm all the way down. Now the reason that I'm doing this is because this just gives me a quick reference for my screw locations and my staples once I get to that point. Before I get into the assembly, let's go ahead and cut our back panel now, just because it'll make the assembly process much easier. And also, to be clear, you don't have to use a back panel, but typically on an upper cabinet, you're definitely gonna want it, because you don't want to open up the cabinet and then see the wall behind it and see the nailers. So this is just a way to, one, cover up the nailers, and two, just give the interior of the cabinet a nice look. So to determine the width of our back panel, we need to understand the width of our top and bottom of the cabinet. So in this case, we've got 423mm. Now, going back to the depth of cut that I made for these channels, we know that I cut 8mm into each one. So that gives us a total of 16. So we should add 16mm to this cabinet. Me personally, I like to drop a millimeter off of that just to give a little bit of room. So in this instance, we are going to add 15, and that gives us 438mm wide. So now let's determine the height that we need. So first measurement I need is the side of my cabinet, which is 763. So 763. Now, I want to know the thickness of my top and bottom together. And in this case, we're actually looking at 35. So 763 minus 35 is 728. So that is my opening space. Now, because I need to go into the groove for the top and bottom, we're again going to add 15mm, giving us that 1mm buffer, and that is going to be the total length of the back panel. So 728 plus 15 is 743. So we have 743 by 438. That's how big the panel needs to be, so we're going to go cut that. And this is, again, another reason why I prefer using metric, because figuring out the numbers to me is just so much easier than having to deal with a bunch of fractions and 32nds and 64ths and eighths and everything else. All right, so now let's go ahead and get into the assembly. And the assembly method that I'm going to show you is the most simple, basic method. Now, again, this method is assuming that these cabinets are going to go side by side and the sides are not visible. Say if you were redoing a kitchen or it was in part of an enclosed portion of the wall. This is my favorite method for constructing the carcass. And so it starts with me using a flat reference surface, this being my table. I have my line here. I have the back of the cabinet here that lines up with the back of the cabinet there. Everything is flush. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using a narrow crown stapler, and I'm going to have a couple of staples along this line. And that's just to give it some bite and some holding power, because that makes putting in the screws much, much easier. And you can do the same thing with a brad nailer. I just prefer using a narrow crown stapler. So now I can let go. It has plenty of holding power, and this is going to allow me the opportunity to go ahead and get some screws in it. A very common question I get is what screws I like to use for cabinets, and I pretty much exclusively use Power Pro screws for a couple of reasons, but the biggest reason is that they self-tap very, very, very well, and in most cases, it doesn't require any pre-drilling whatsoever. So depending on the material you're using, in a lot of cases, I can just screw that screw in and it doesn't split the wood, and it actually dives into that wood really, really well and countersinks itself really well and pretty clean overall. Typically on cabinet applications, I usually will pre-drill, but in times where I just don't want to and I want to get stuff thrown together real quick. That's one of the reasons why I really like using those screws. And that's another reason why having this line is actually very helpful, because it ensures that I'm not so close to the edge that I might have the tendency to split the wood. And again, this plywood is some pretty good quality plywood, so it allows me to do it. So I'll go ahead and do these without pre-drilling. The other common question I get is how long of a screw I use. These are 1 3/4. That's pretty much my go-to for this application. Sometimes I use 2, sometimes I use 1.5 inches, but these I find to be really good. All right, so I got my screws, and on something this deep, typically I'll do 3, sometimes I'll do 4 or 5. It just, for this video, I'm just gonna do 3. It's more than enough holding power. All right, so now we're gonna go ahead and put this back panel in there. Sometimes you just gotta make sure it's not caught up on anything. There we go. And as you can see, I've got a little bit of clearance here to allow for that top panel. We'll go ahead and check. Typically that panel is gonna help square this up, but as long as, you know, cut everything nice and square, everything should be nice and square as you go ahead and assemble it. So now we can go ahead and get the top on. Finally, the last side, right on that line. And if you don't feel comfortable, you know, just screwing without pre-drilling, well, this is again where that line comes in really handy. Just use the appropriate size countersink bit, screw your holes, drill your holes rather. And there we go, we have a box. Before we get into doing the door, we have one more thing that we need to add to this cabinet, and that is the nailers. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna place one at the top and one at the bottom. And again, that's to give you something to screw through the cabinet to hold it to the wall into a stud. Now, before I said, let's assume that this cabinet is hanging on a wall and I have another cabinet right next to it and another cabinet right next to it. The way the sides look do not matter, right? But what if you needed one side, say it's at the end, you have a wall on one end, and you need it to be visible on the other end? Well, there's a lot of things you can do. You can put a laminate over it, you can build a decorative panel for it, or you can make it to where the screws are not visible. And a way that you can do that is with pocket holes, which is perfect for cabinetry. So in this application, I'm going to show you putting in these nailers using pocket holes, and that's to alleviate the need to drive screws through the top and bottom, even though realistically the top and bottom of this cabinet would not be visible. However, for the purposes of this video, let's use some pocket holes. Now, because I cut these at the same time I cut my tops and bottoms, they should be a perfect fit, and as you can see, they are. So I just slide it in there, push it down, everything is nice and flush, and so the only thing left to do is use some pocket screws and screw this thing in place. So to recap, we built the carcass for a frameless cabinet. Now we're gonna talk about putting a full overlay door on. For this door, I'm just using a plywood panel simply for the instructional purposes of this video. If you would like to see a video on how you can make shaker style doors using just a table saw and a single blade, I will leave a link to that video that I have down in the video description. So now we're gonna get into actually determining the size of the door that we want. And there's a few things that you need to consider for this. One, you obviously need to know which hinges you're using because each hinge might have different specifications. The next thing is you want to identify how big you want your reveal to be. And then the third thing you want to consider is there another cabinet next to this that is also going to have a door, because that's going to affect your measurements. So for this instance, it is a single cabinet. We're going to do a 2mm reveal all the way around. And here shortly, I'm going to be showing you exactly which hinge we are going to be using. So let's get some measurements and figure out exactly how big the door panel has to be. All right, so the first measurement that we need to know, let's go with the width. And the width of this cabinet is 18 inches, as we discussed earlier, but that is actually 458 millimeters. And the height of the cabinet, I mentioned before, was 30 inches, which is 762 millimeters. And I mentioned before that I want to have a 2mm reveal all the way around. This is a single cabinet, one door, and I want to have a nice even reveal all the way around. So we're going to do 2mm. So what do we need to do? We know that this is 762. So if I want a 2mm reveal at the top and a 2mm reveal at the bottom, then we know I need to be 758 millimeters. And if this is 458, we need to subtract 4 from that, so 454. So that is the size that we need to cut for this panel. All right, so let's give it a quick test here. 2 millimeters, just want to make sure that I'm where I need to be. And I am. So let's go ahead and start the process of the hinges. Before we get into the hinge installation, I want to show you the hinges that I'm using. These are the Blum full overlay hinges, and these are the plates. And we're going to walk through the steps for each one of these. And I'll leave the part numbers for these if you wanted to use these exact same hinges down in the video description. But these ones specifically are for full overlay doors. And here I just wanted to show you a difference between two different hinges. So these are for the full overlay, which is what we're using in this video. And then this is the same model Blum hinge. However, this is for an inset door. And as you can see, it's a pretty significant difference between the two, the way that they're laid out. However, both of them can use the same plates. So let's make this as simple as possible. We need to identify where we need the actual plate to go. Not necessarily the depth that it goes from the front edge just yet, but where we need the actual plate. And to make this very simple, we're going to measure from the outside edge of the cabinet, we're going to measure 100 millimeters. And we're going to mark a line. We're going to mark a line at the bottom, and we're going to do the exact same thing to the top. Now, the next thing that I want to do is I want to transfer that line on the inside of the cabinet. This is going to be my reference line for the hinge plate. I'm going to do that there, and I'm going to do that again at the top. Okay, so now we have our reference line. That reference line is for this. And what this is this is a jig that gives you the proper spacing to pre-drill your holes. Now let's talk about this for a second. This jig specifically works perfectly for these hinge plates. And what I mean by that is that the distance that the holes need to be drilled are 37 millimeters from the edge of the cabinet, and the spacing for the holes is 32 millimeters. Where do you find that information? Just about every hinge comes with instructions, or the instructions can be found online. And in this instance with Blum, you can actually get a catalog from Blum that has all the information in it. So this little jig just makes it very handy. This is from Rockler. They're relatively inexpensive. You don't have to have these, but they have all different layouts for different hinges, whether it's inset, whether it's full overlay. So what we need to do now is bring that over to the line that's on it, covers our reference line. And once we have it in place, then we're going to take a self-centering drill bit and we're going to drill those holes out. I'm just going to hold this in place. And there we go. Now I have my pre-drilled hole locations for the plate. And once we drill our holes, we're going to go ahead and put our hinge plate on the inside of the cabinet here. So I like to start with one screw, and I don't tighten it down quite all the way tight. I'm going to take my second screw. Still want a little bit of movement in there. Line that up with the hole. Screw in my second. And these are self-centering, so you'll see it adjust just like it did right there, just a little bit. Not quite all the way tight. Let this one budge if it needs to. And we're good to go. And the orientation that you put these in, these rest on a little bar on the back side of the hinge, and this little hole right here actually goes towards the inside of the cabinet. So just an easy reference, but if you make some jigs, because you use a lot of the same hardware, it's an easy reference for the future. Okay, so now we need to install the hinges on the back side of the door. And so before, we measured 100 millimeters from the edge. Well, we already know that we took 4 millimeters off of this door total to give us a 2 millimeter reveal all the way around. So that means that I need to measure from 98 from the top, 98 from the bottom, make my line, and that's how I can ensure that it all lines up properly. Same thing applies. I'm going to give myself a nice reference line, and now we go to the drill press. With just about every one of these Euro style hinges that I know of, you're going to need a 35 millimeter Forstner bit, and that's what this is right here. The next thing is you need to understand what the tab, is what it's referred to, is for the hinge that you're using. And those hinges specifically call for a 5 millimeter tab. And what the tab is the distance from the edge of the door to the edge of the hole that you're drilling. And all this little piece of plastic is, again, this is another jig from Rockler that I bought that just comes in really handy. You can make these out of plywood or MDF and just have these templates laying around, but this just helps set this drill bit up a lot faster. So what I'm going to be doing here is setting my fence location to where I know that my fence is 5 millimeters away from the cutter. It's really easy to do. You just drop the drill bit down into the hole that's already there, and then you can bring your fence right up against it. And once you have your fence up against it, you can hold it in place and tighten it down. And then just to double check, come back down, and we're good to go. All right, now once I have my drill bit set, it's now time to go ahead and cut it to the desired depth, which you can play with a little bit. You can keep some scrap pieces around in your shop. But what I'm doing right now is I'm using the point of that Forstner bit and using that line as a reference. So once I know I'm in the right spot, the drilling depth that I typically go on these is right around the 13 millimeter mark. So I'm going to go ahead and drill my hole. And before I do this, to be clear, you don't need to do this at a drill press by any means. There's lots of really good jigs. You can use a drill, makes it very easy. I just like to use the drill press. So after we've drilled our hinge cup location, I can put my hinge in, use a square just to make sure everything lines up, and then we'll go ahead and pre-drill those holes. And just to make sure it stays nice and steady, then I can take my screws, place them in their corresponding holes, and I follow a similar procedure for these, and I tighten one down close to being tight, and I just go to the other one just to allow it to center itself. Tighten that down, and then I'll install the hinge on the other side. All right, so let's go ahead and clip this door in real quick. Make sure everything lines up. Once you get it lined up, it should just snap into place just like that. Snap into place. Go ahead and close it. And now the only thing left to do is make some minor adjustments, because right now I'm pretty much flush. So I want to come over just a couple of millimeters and possibly maybe come up just a little bit. So let me show you how to do that. Okay, so there are various adjustments that you can make for these hinges. And the first one that you'll see right here, this is if I need to move the panel left or right. So I can simply adjust this, and I need to go to the right just a little bit. So that's one adjustment that you can make. You can also push the door in and out by using this screw. And then this screw down here on the bottom actually will loosen the plate. And if you do both of them, you can actually shift this up or down a little bit if needed. I have the necessary adjustments I needed to make for my door, and as you can see, it opens up. The only thing left to do is we need to put in our adjustable shelf. And this will go in here just like so, nice and flush in the front, nice and tight to the back. Soft close, and just like that. Full overlay door, frameless cabinet, really, really simple to build. And if you have a lot of these to do and you start to get down in a rhythm, I mean, you can knock these things out really, really quick. Nice, clean look. It would definitely look better if I had a different door on it, but that would have made this video way too long. So hope you guys found that helpful. Okay, so that's going to do it for this video. If you found that information helpful, consider subscribing, hit the notification bell, and all the other things that everybody always asks you to do. If you guys want to find out more about what I'm doing, or if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section down below, or go over to Instagram. You can find me there at bentswoodworking. You can shoot me a message. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And finally, if you want to see everything that I'm doing and everything that I offer, or you want to help support me and my channel, head over to my website, bentswoodworking.com. Until next time, everybody, get out in the shop, try something new, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks. These are the Salice F70 undermount drawer slides. And in this video, I'm going to demonstrate a really fast, simple drawer box construction. And then I'm going to show you exactly how you install these undermount drawer slides. Let me start by giving you a quick breakdown of the materials. You see multiple pieces here that have already been cut. This right here is going to be the back. This right here is going to be the front. And you will see that the back is only cut to where the groove is. I'll talk about the grooves in a second. These two pieces right here are the sides, so groove, groove, groove. They're all there to accept this panel. The material that I'm using is 12 millimeter Baltic birch. I like that on my drawer boxes, mainly because I like the exposed look of the plies. Now, a couple of measurements to note. The length of the sides is always going to match what your drawer box is. So in this case, these are 21 inch or 533 millimeters. So I know very quickly that my sides are going to be that length. Your fronts and backs are the opening of your cabinet minus 42 millimeters. And that's how you get the measurement for the fronts and backs. These grooves were cut on a router table using a router bit, and I basically just crept up until I made sure that I had a really nice fit that I was looking for with my bottom panel, and the depth is 6 millimeters. So this is exactly 12 millimeters thick. I'm going half the thickness, which is something I do pretty standard. So to start this off, I'm going to start with a side and the front. I've got my groove down towards the table, and I'm using my table as the reference surface just to make sure that everything comes together nice and tight. Couple other things. I'm going to clamp this because I am using pocket holes. I am using the Castle 110 pocket hole cutter. These don't shift around as much, but it's still a good practice when you're using pocket screws if you want everything to line up to clamp it down. So that's what I will be doing. And I also want to highlight that I am not using glue for this drawer box. Why would I not be using glue? Well, you absolutely can if you want to, but I just want to demonstrate that, you know, this joint and this drawer box construction with the screws going into the side, which is going to allow that pressure as you're pulling in and out, this is plenty strong enough for most applications. So just to prove that, I'm comfortable. This is for my own kitchen island, so that's what I'm going to do. And all I'm doing there is I'm just tapping this to where it's perfectly flush. I mean, absolutely perfectly flush. Tighten it down. Go ahead and apply my 2 pocket screws here and drive those home. Now that those are screwed in nice and flush, I can switch and do the same thing on the other side. Next, I'll be putting the bottom panel inside of the drawer. And one thing I want to highlight is I like my grain to move across the drawer when you open it up. And so that is how I've cut the panels here. I would also like to highlight that I have sanded all of these pieces before assembling it, because that way when it's assembled, I can spray it and not have to worry about trying to get into tight corners to get all of my sanding done. So this is just going to slide right into the grooves, all the way down. I check here, I'm nice and flush. Now I can go ahead and put this so the bottom is actually facing upward, and now I'll put the back piece on. With the back, I'm basically following the same steps that I took before, and I'm just going to slide this in there. And at this point, I still have the ability to move the sides out a little bit. So I'm going to get this pretty close to being flush, and we're going to get this clamped together. Everything's flush, everything's clamped together. Drive the screws home. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to attach the bottom to this back stretcher using some screws, which I'll show you in just a moment. But there's a couple ways that you can make drawer boxes for undermount drawer slides. One requires you to cut a notch in the back, or if you do like I just did, I now have a flat bottom all the way across the back, and the reason for that is because the drawer slide needs to sit in this opening, which is why you would cut a notch. Now for this assembly, we don't need to worry about a notch. We just create the box and we could assemble everything. To attach this, I'm only going to do it in 3 sections. I like to do it in the middle and then more out towards the ends, but not all the way to the ends. Next, just drive in these small screws. And we now have a solid connection and a very strong drawer. Now the assembly of the drawer box itself is not necessarily universal to this particular set of drawer slides. It's just a quick, no-nonsense way to put together a drawer box. But there are 2 very, very specific things that we need to do for undermount drawer slides, and specifically these. And the first one is we need to drill a hole back here for the locating pin. This is the locating pin. Now the good news is the location of that hole for this locating pin is pretty much universal among most of the leading undermount drawer slide brands. And the way that we do that is either through the measurements that are in the book, which I'm going to go over all of the measurements for these here momentarily, but you can also use something like this. This is just a Rockler undermount drilling guide, and this will allow you to perfectly locate where you need to drill that locating hole. And as you can see, now we have our locating hole, and we do the same thing to the other side. The second part that is specific to undermount drawer slides is the installation of the clips, which you can see here. While they do look the same, they are different. One is for the right side, one is for the left side, and those typically can be indicated on the part. And with the Salice, you can see right here right, and you can see right here left. Now just remember, when you're looking at the drawer box, it's going to be the opposite of that, because this is actually the right side when it's flipped up the right way. An easy way to remember is these brackets, these points, need to go into the corner just like this. Now there are a couple different mounting options. I can mount it through some screws that are right here that will go into this front piece. Myself, I'm going to mount directly into the bottom right there in one of those three holes. And remember, all the way to the corner, and then I'm just going to hold it tight in place, and I'm going to drive in my first screw. I'm not pre-drilling or anything for these. The screws that I'm using are just standard 5/8 inch cabinet screws that you would use for any hinge or any drawer slide. Let me bring you in closer for this one so you can see the layout of the holes better. The construction of the drawer is complete now. We can really just take this and set it off to the side. The next thing that needs to happen is we need to install the slide into the cabinet box. Let me bring you in closer to show you exactly what we have with this cabinet. What you're looking at right now is one of the side panels for this cabinet box, and this right here, the edge banded portion, is the front of the cabinet. I have my first row of holes, and I have a back row of holes. Now to highlight something, I don't do a third screw in the drawer slides usually, just because I don't really find it to be that necessary. So the only thing that I'm concerning myself with is the front row and the back row, and if I wanted to add one later after they're installed, it's very easy to do once they're in the cabinet. I want to talk about a couple of measurements, the first being 37 millimeters. So the center line of this row is 37 millimeters from the front. Now, that is pretty universal among any slides that you are going to use, that at least one of the hole locations will line up with 37 millimeters. The back row that I'm using is completely dependent on the slide that you are using, and you can find this information in the manual online or with whatever instructions your slides come with. But in this case, I knew that my back row needed to be 421 millimeters from the front edge. So I bored all of these holes prior to even getting my drawer slides because I knew what the measurements were. And then that way, when I get them, all I have to do is install them. One other thing that I would like to add is that you see that I have a variety of holes here, and you might be wondering, well, how many drawers are you putting in here? And the answer to that is I'm only putting 3 drawers in here. However, by just taking the time to plunge all of these out, it gives you the ability to adjust if needed during the install, or if you decide to change your cabinet drawer box size, or you want to add a drawer, it's very easy to do, and all of this will be inside of the cabinet where it'll never be seen. I want to take a couple of minutes to show you where you can find this information. So again, I said I was using Salice F70 slides for this new kitchen island that I'm building. And they, just like Blum and other companies, do in fact have a manual that shows the different measurements. Now here what I want to show you is, let's go exactly with the 21 inch that I am using. So these are 533 millimeters, and this is where I found the information that I needed. So right here you can see from the front edge of the cabinet all the way to this particular hole, it's 421. The other thing that you'll notice is that from the front edge of the cabinet till this hole right here, I'm just going up here because it's easier for you to see, 37 millimeters. So it is a perfect intersect with this hole right here at 37 millimeters back, and that's including a 4 millimeter setback that is on these slides, meaning that the front edge of the slide is not perfectly flush with the cabinet. It does in fact sit a little bit back. But if you plunge that first hole at 37 and you use that hole right here to mount it, then it's automatically going to give you that setback. Now, as we go through this catalog, you will see some things that I already had talked about, and that is the locating pin location for this rear hook. It has the measurements right here. This is the notch that I was referring to, and it actually tells you exactly the max and minimums that these things need to be cut. We obviously took that out of the equation completely because we have a flat bottom all the way across. And then right here is where it breaks down the length of your sides, the fronts, the backs, and you can see here X minus 42. That's how you get the measurement for the fronts and backs, and X being the opening of your cabinet, the space for that. So if that was 1,000, it would be 1,000 minus 42, and that's how big this piece is going to be across. And finally, one other thing to make sure that you pay attention to is for this particular runner, I have a range of 12 millimeter or 1/2 inch all the way to 16 millimeter or 5/8 for drawer thickness material. Now, the reason why there is a cap on that is because this distance from here to here, that side panel actually fits in this groove. So you couldn't use these slides and 3/4 inch drawer material. You would have to get a different set of slides. Hopefully that makes sense. When installing slides, especially multiple sets of slides, I really enjoy actually laying the cabinet on its side because it makes the install really easy because you're not fighting with gravity. So once I have my holes lined up, I almost always start on the front. And the reason for that is because these will auto center, and I always want to get that front one nice because I want to make sure that setback is correct. Once that's in there, I can come back to the back, make sure that everything's lined up, and drive it in. And now my slide is installed. On one side, I can flip this over and install the other one. Now that both the slides are installed, here's the absolute best part of using undermount drawer slides, and that is the fact that the installation process is so easy. I just clip them in and it's done. But as with other undermount drawer slides, these orange levers right here is actually going to be what unlocks the drawer box from the slide. And then we do have some adjustability built into these clips. And you'll notice that with this particular clip, we have some adjustability here, and we have an adjustability wheel here. And basically what these are going to do on both sides, this is going to allow you to move the drawer box left and right. So after you put your drawer fronts on, if you need to work on your reveals a little bit, you have some adjustability there. But we also have the adjustability on this wheel to make the cabinet drawer go in or out, right? So we do have some movement forward and backwards as well with these clips. So if you're looking to install or find a new undermount drawer slide to use, an alternative, the Salice F70, this is how you install it. These are the measurements, and this is a simple drawer box construction. Let's get into it. We've got some undermount drawer slides. The reason that I just built this box this way is because not only are you going to be able to see what's going on in the front and on the sides, but I'm actually going to be able to show you some things on the back, which is really going to make this a lot easier for people to understand. The slides that we're using are these Blum undermount drawer slides. These are the 563H model. These one in particular are 15-inch. The cabinet itself, I think, is 16 inches deep, just so I can really give you a good view from every direction. So the first thing that's going to make this process a lot easier is actually having the manual that shows you everything you need to know. The reason I wanted to share this is because if you contact Blum, you can get manuals for their products. And today we're going to be talking about the 563H, which is on this page here. And you can also reference all this material online. So everything you need to know is right here on this sheet of paper. And I'm going to walk you through the steps so you can visualize everything better, but I will be referencing this book a lot because it gives me the information that we need. So with Blum undermount drawer slides, there are a few things that we need to know. And I've actually marked these boards up really good to kind of help everybody understand exactly what we have to do step by step. And we're going to talk about each one of these, and then once we get done talking about each one of the pieces, I'll quickly assemble this just using some brad nails for the video, and then we'll go ahead and install it and you can see just how easy it actually is. So the first thing that we need to know for Blum undermount drawer slides is going to be the width of our opening. And I'm going to be putting the drawer in the bottom of this just because it's a lot easier to work out. But we want to get a measurement of the opening, okay? And so in this case, the opening is 16 inches or 412 millimeters. And I'm going to be referring to both imperial and metric in this video. The same thing as in the book. The primary is metric, but there's also an imperial equivalent. But it doesn't matter which one you use, it's covered on this. So now I know 16 inches, 412 millimeters. Now what do I do with that number? So this is where we can go back to the book, right? And this is what I want you to pay attention to. So you have your opening width minus 42, that's 42 millimeters, or minus 1 and 21/32. And here's a really good example of why I like using metric. But either way, so let's go to our piece of wood and figure out what we do from here. Okay, so here is my front, here is my back. I'll talk about those here in just a minute. These two right here are my sides. I'll talk about the sides in just a minute. We've already established that the opening minus 42 millimeters or 1 and 21/32, my opening is 412 millimeters or 16 inches, which means if I subtract 42 millimeters from 412, it gives me 370. Or 1 and 21/32 from 16 gives me 14 and 11/32. What does all that mean? That means that my front piece must be that long. So now I have my measurement to cut my front and my back piece. Now let me show you why this measurement is important. If I put my drawer slides in the bottom of this cabinet, that distance that they're referring to is the distance needed to clear this edge and this edge. And when you cut your pieces, just to make sure that your measurements are correct, you can actually lay your slides down and take a look, and now I know I have the proper clearance. My boards are going to fit in here. This is where the sides come into play. If I want to test to make sure that the entire box itself is going to fit, I can do so by taking the sides and ensuring that they're all going to fit. And I know that everything based on that is going to work just fine. And I would suggest doing this the first time you cut your first piece for the front or back, if you're using this drawer box construction, which is a very basic drawer box construction method. But this way you know that you've cut your piece the right size. What you don't want to do is cut your pieces the wrong size, make all your drawers, then go to put them in and find out that they don't fit. Ask me how I know. Okay, so the front's out of the way. Let's talk about the back. Well, the back is exactly the same size. However, there's an addition that you have to make for the back. And here in just a minute, I'll show you why you make that addition. And there's a couple other things that we're going to do once I construct this box. So what we're looking at now is the drawer back preparation. So I'm going to talk you through all of these measurements and what all of these measurements mean and why. But again, it's in the book. So the distance for this back notch is a 1/2 inch from the bottom minimum, or 13 millimeters. And if you look on the back of this, you'll notice it runs right into the bottom of the groove for the panel. That's important because this notch and the bottom of the box is what sits on the drawer slides. The distance from the edge to here is a minimum of 35 millimeters or 1 3/8. Can you go larger? Sure, you can. Do you want to go smaller? No. So now let me show you on the drawer slides how this works. So back to our drawer slides and our demo. This is how the back of the drawer is going to sit on the slides. So just like this. Notice, if I was any shorter, it's not going to fit. I have a little bit of play, but let's say I cut those notches only 1.5 inches wide. Guess what? The box isn't going to fit. Now I know a lot of people will want to know, well, how do you cut these? There's many ways that you can do this. You can use a jigsaw. You can use the bandsaw. You can use the table saw with a single blade, with a dado stack. You can use a router table. You can use a domino. All you're doing is trying to remove this little chunk of material to be even with the groove. And to highlight again, this groove, note whether you're using a 1/2 inch for the demonstration on this video, everything I'm using is 1/2 inch ply or 12 millimeter ply. This needs to be a 1/2 inch from the bottom. So if I use a 1/4 inch, it doesn't matter. If I use 3/4 of an inch, this groove, the bottom of this groove, has to be a 1/2 inch for these particular undermount drawer slides. We've covered the front, we've covered the back, now we cover the sides. The sides is super easy. The sides is determined by the drawer slide size. So I'm using 15-inch drawer slides, which is 381 millimeters. So the piece that I'm using front to back for the sides of my box is the same size as your drawer slide. And again, that can also be found in the book in this table down in the bottom. Like I said before, I'm just going to pin nail this drawer together real quick just so we can complete the entire process and I can show you how everything works. Okay, so now it's time to do everything else that we need to get done for the drawer box itself, and then we're going to focus on installing the slides. I circled these holes. These holes need to be drilled out to accept the locating pins on the slides. More importantly, or to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, we're referring to this pin right here, because this will go in the back and there's some adjustments that can be made, but this has to actually sit inside of that hole. If you don't do those holes, this isn't going to go all the way back. So how do we drill those holes out? Well, you can reference the exact location in the manual, or you can get something like this. Blum makes one. This one is from Rockler. This is specifically designed for undermount drawer slides. I'll leave a link to this down in the video description. They're all essentially the same thing. This works really well, and here's how it works. So it does two things. Okay, we need to do these holes, and we also need to pre-drill holes for these clips, which I'll talk about in a second. In order to do this, this rests on this lip and there on the bottom of the drawer. So it sits just like that. From there, you have your left side and you have your right side. So we're going to drill that hole. We're going to bring this over here, make sure it's all the way over to the side, and we're going to drill that hole. To drill that hole, the kit comes with this drill bit and a stop collar. And you just determine the thickness based on the material that you're using. We drill this hole and we're good to go. It's extremely easy. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, so our holes are drilled. Now we're going to turn the box so we're referencing the front. All right, so what are these? These are the clips that have adjustments. There's a couple different styles that you can get. Ones that don't have this adjustment and ones that do, like these. This just gives you lateral adjustment left or right, but these are also adjusted up and down. So there's a lot of very simple adjustments that you can make. The slides themselves also click into these, and this is how you can take the drawer on and off. Very, very simple design. So when you're setting these up, two things we need to be aware of. One, the orange goes in, right? Easiest way to remember it. You have to buy left clips and right clips, but the orange goes inward. These fit over in the corner just like this. But what we need to make sure that we do is we pre-drill some hole locations to assist in the assembly. Just like the other drill bit, the Rockler jig comes with the drill bit for pre-drilling these. Now, this one works much the same, except now we're using the other two holes. This makes it very simple for you. Jig it, undermount drilling guide, and has an arrow. That arrow always goes into the corner. So you just put it into the corner, drill your hole, drill your other hole, flip this over, come down to the other side, drill your hole, drill your other hole, and you're good. Now, we're going to install our clips. It's just 2 screws in each one. And for those of you that are wondering, why is he taking all that time to screw it in by hand? Why can't you use a drill? You can. Just make sure you have your clutch settings on the right setting so it doesn't strip it out. This drawer box is now done. We're going to set this to the side. We're going to get the slides installed. All right, so on to the drawer slides and installing them. Inevitably, I am going to get people who complain because I didn't show them how to do it with a face frame. This application that I'm showing you is for a frameless cabinet that would have an overlay drawer front. At the end of the video, I will briefly discuss how you could modify this with a face frame, how you could modify this if it was an inset. And I don't know if you noticed, but I'm kind of showing you how to do those things right now. So for the purposes of this video, frameless, overlay, I'll talk about the rest at the end. So the first thing we need to do when we're installing these, for this specific application, we want the front edge to be 3 millimeters from the front. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One, the box itself is going to protrude slightly past this, slightly, depending on the thickness of material that you're using. It's also going to allow for the drawer to be pulled in tight because these are soft close, and it's actually going to pull it back towards it to ensure that you're good. So we're installing these on the bottom. Okay, just for ease of demonstration purposes. If you wanted to install these higher up, you could always put spacers and use that as your alignment. But the first thing we need to do, make sure that it's 3 millimeters. To do that, I'm just setting my Polini pocket rule, whatever you have, 3 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch. I said I was going to do both imperial and metric, right? And once I have that set, I know that that's where I need to do my pre-drilling. And to do this, I'm going to pre-drill 3 hole locations, but I'm going to start with one. I'm going to do one in the front, one in the center, and one back here. But I'm going to do this one first just to make sure this one is set, and it'll actually make the next 2 a lot easier. So before I do this, I actually want to share with you guys a trick that I find installing drawer slides, especially pre-drilling my hole locations, a heck of a lot easier, and that is turning the cabinet on its side. I don't care what kind of drawer slide I'm doing, then that way I don't have to worry about gravity being an issue. Come up here to the front, I'm at 3 millimeters, I'm good to go. I can drill my first hole location. To drill these holes, I'm gonna use a self-centering bit. Personally, I like to use 5 millimeter Euro screws when I'm using these, or any drawer slides for that matter. However, I am out, so I'm gonna use the more common style screw. So I'm just gonna hold this in place. Okay. Got my first hole drilled. I'm gonna go ahead and place my first screw in the hole just to keep everything nice and steady so I don't have to worry about it as much from this point forward. Okay, first screw is in. It's good to go. I'm gonna go ahead and pre-drill my next 2 screw locations. Those 2 are done. I guess for this demonstration, I probably didn't need to do 3. I could have just done one in the front and one in the back, but you know what? This is how I normally do it. All right. One side's done. I'm going to flip it over, do the other side, and then we're going to throw a box in there. Bring you over to this side so you guys can get a closer look at what I was doing before. Got my 3 millimeters. Drill my hole. Insert my screw. Screw that in. Again, you don't have to do this by hand. But with drawer slides, especially in melamine, even though this is an example, it's a good idea. I'll get the last 2 done. All right, drawer slides are installed. Knock everything else over in the shop. Moment of truth. We're gonna put the drawer box inside. This is the direction that it's gonna go in, this being the back, right? So we're gonna flip this over. And I really hope this all works out, or else I'm going to look like I don't know what I'm doing, which does happen sometimes. All right, so this is one thing that I really like about the undermount drawer slides, right? So I put it in there. It's just sitting on it right now. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to push this back, and I want you to listen for the clicks. That's it. It's done. It's in. Soft close. Just like that. Undermount drawer slides are really easy. I don't ever want to switch back to anything else. I absolutely love the undermount drawer slides, and I'm so glad that I finally tried it. And once I screwed up a couple of times, I was able to figure out what I was doing wrong. Now I'm going to show you a couple of different features about them. So before I had mentioned you have to drill those holes. Matter of fact, let's give you a better visual here. So right here we have this little point. This point is meant to go into this hole. So let's go ahead and get these lined up. I'll click this back on. Okay, so we're good. Now, the purpose of those is if I needed to raise the back of the cabinet for some reason, I can utilize this right here. If I can twist it with my awkward hand. And I'm raising the cabinet up. That piece of metal that goes in there is basically allowing this, as I move this, it's gonna raise the back of the cabinet. And this is really helpful because sometimes you have to make certain adjustments for the reveal on your drawer fronts. So that's a possibility. Anytime I install these, I always make sure they're completely down. And it's very rare that I've ever had to adjust the rear. Typically, I can get most of the adjustments done that I need in the front. But that's the back, and that's why I didn't put it back on this, so you guys could see the purpose of that. So now let's go over to the front. Now I know the lighting underneath the cabinet may not be the best, but it's okay. Pulling in on these orange pieces here, this is how I can remove it from the slides. And then I have a couple of different adjustments. There's a little gray tab here. If I push that in, it's gonna raise the front. Hopefully you can see it as it goes down. So if I need to go up, I can just push it back. It gives me the adjustment to go up or down. Right? And that's the same on both sides. And then also these have adjustments, this wheel that I showed you, you can buy them with or without. These are to allow you to move the drawer left and right to adjust anything that you need to adjust. So there's a lot of adjustability built into these to where you don't have to take off the slides in order to do it. It's with the box on there, which makes it really nice. And then finally, I just wanted to show you, so when you're installing these, this protrudes past the edge of this about 1 millimeter. Now, if you use thicker material, like 5/8 inch, I always use 1/2 inch, it's really easy to figure everything out because it's pretty much just right at the edge of this, right? So now, imagine putting a drawer front on here, it's always going to have that, see how it wants to pull it back? It's gonna ensure that that keeps that drawer front tight against the face frame. Also, you may end up making some adjustments that shift it, right? So you have that little bit of adjustability. Again, this would be an application if I was putting a drawer front over it and it was going to overlay over this. All right, so I did say I would address some other ways that you could do this at the end of the video. So let's say that I wanted to have inset doors. Let's say these were edge banded and I wanted the doors to be flush with the front. Okay, in order to do that, exactly the same steps. The only difference is the front edge of this needs to be the thickness of the drawer front material from the edge. That's it. Same exact steps. This just gets slid back to account for the thickness of the drawer front. So what if you had a face frame? I'm gonna show you kind of what you can do for that, right? There's a couple of different ways that you can do this. So let's pretend, obviously you want to make sure that the drawer slide itself is above the base, okay? So maybe we're installing this higher up so this wouldn't be an issue, but even if it was the bottom, right? We need to have something for this to rest on, not necessarily rest on, but to space it to clear this lip, okay? So this is just here as an example. If I was to put this on here like this, well, clearly my box isn't going to open because this is right here. So how do we combat that? That's where spacer blocks that you can put into your cabinet come into play. And you'd run this all the way to the back, and that's what you'd be attaching your drawer slide to. The thickness of this isn't exactly the same as this. That's why you see this little protrusion here. But for demonstration purposes, now if we wanted it to be an overlay, same thing applies. I'm going to do my 3 millimeter spacing here. I'm going to use this front hole and I'm going to drill that into the face frame, and then I'm going to use the middle one in the center and the middle one in the back. That's how you can combat that, and that's how you would apply them to a face frame application. Now let's say I didn't want to go to all the trouble of adding spacers. What else can I do? Well, that's where you can get these clips here that actually are meant specifically for that. And these clips mount to the backing of your cabinet. And with these, you actually have some play, because you'll notice this slides forward and backward. And it basically just goes in this channel just like this. Now, these are additional pieces that you would have to buy in order to do that. But if you didn't want to worry about spacers, you would attach it in the front and you would attach it to that clip in the back. Now, there are certain measurements that you have to keep into consideration. Your cabinet can only be so deep. And all of that stuff is, guess what? In that book, all of the measurements. It's extremely helpful. This is also an option. And you can just have it attached in the front and attached to that clip in the back. And it would basically sit just like this. To give you guys an example, this would be drilled up against the back. This is out in the front. As long as the cabinet depth is right, you're good to go. So that's how you can do different applications. In a recent video, I demonstrated how I prepared and assembled frameless cabinets. And a common question that I received from that video was, how do I level them? Or what do I use as a toe kick? So in this video, I'm going to show you the process that I take in order to ensure level cabinets.
So I build separate toe kicks that I will place all of my cabinets on for the majority of my projects. I find this is much easier because I can take my time leveling the toe kick and not worrying about leveling each cabinet individually. The first step that I take is to rip all of my pieces to the width required to achieve the height that I am looking for. The construction method that I use is very, very easy. I build some L's and I build some T's. And the L's are used on the ends of the toe kicks. And the T's are going to be used anywhere that the two cabinets are touching each other. The materials that I use are typically just scrap plywood that is left over from whatever cabinet project I'm working on. I don't use any glue, and I only assemble them by first using a narrow crown stapler to hold all of the pieces together until I am able to pre-drill and drive some screws in to hold everything tightly together. These don't need to be overbuilt, as they are just a platform for boxes that will then be attached to the studs in the wall. Once I've assembled all of the T's and L's that I mentioned, and we'll just call them the supports, I will then measure where all of the joints of all of my cabinets are going to butt up against each other. These measurements will be used to determine the placement of the supports. Once those measurements are identified, I will then mark those measurements on my front and back pieces of the toe kick. From there, I will start assembly of the toe kick following the same procedure of first stapling everything together and then going back and securing everything with screws. I will first attach everything to the front stretcher. Then I can stand it upright and add the back stretcher. When using 3/4 inch material as I am here, I will typically use 1.5 inch screws. I also just pre-drill everything to avoid splitting of any wood. So this right here is going to give you a better visual of the layout of the supports and how they are lined up perfectly with where the separate cabinets meet together. These supports are more than suitable to ensure a stable cabinet base and will also give you something to drill into if needed. The next part is the installation and leveling process, and I start by marking all of the stud locations on the wall that the cabinets are actually going to be going on. Next, I'm going to lay out my toe kick or toe kicks, and I say kicks because in this scenario I actually built two because the run of cabinets is about 14 feet long. And for me personally, I just find it a lot easier to build two separate ones and then attach them together during the assembly process. Now, I recently installed a floating floor throughout the entire first floor of my home. So what I am doing here is marking where my toe kick will sit. And then I will actually cut this section of the flooring out. This is not necessary for all flooring types. However, because it is a floating floor, I don't want to pin it down and not allow it to move if needed. To cut this portion of the flooring out, I will actually remove as much as I can with the track saw. And then I'm going to finish off the ends with an oscillating multi-tool. Once cut, I can simply remove the pieces and place the two toe kicks back in place. Before beginning the leveling process, I do want to make sure that I have the correct spacing from the walls on both sides. This toe kick is the exact length of the cabinets, and notice how there is a gap on both sides. Do not waste your time trying to fit everything perfectly into a space. This is exactly what filler strips are for. Building this way will save you a lot of headaches in the future. To level the base, my favorite method is using a laser level. And this I've just found to be the most accurate way to ensure level. Once the laser is set to the desired height, it is simply a matter of taking your time to shim the base where needed. Take your time with this step. The more time you spend here, the more smoothly your box installation will go. Personally, I like to use composite shims. Yes, I know that they are a couple of dollars, literally a couple of dollars more than wood shims, but I do find them much more enjoyable to work with. There isn't really any secrets with this process. Just add shims where needed until the base is parallel with the laser line. After I have one side level, I'll then attach the two bases together. And I do this by simply driving a few screws from each side while also making sure that I have added shims where needed. Once attached, I just continue down the base, shimming when necessary. So once I've gone through that whole process and I know that everything is level, this is where I'm going to go, and I'm actually going to drive screws through the toe kick, through the backside, into the studs to secure the base. While I do this, I do continue to check to make sure that nothing has shifted while screwing it into the studs. When I run into an area that there is a gap between the base and the wall, which will almost certainly happen, I will again use shims to fill that gap. Failure to do so will likely cause the base to twist as you screw it into the wall. The last thing that I like to do before placing the boxes on top of the toe kick is just secure the shims in place. And I wouldn't say that this is absolutely necessary, and you don't need to use screws like I'm doing here. It's just that little assurance that those shims are not going to move and everything is going to stay nice and level. From this point, it's as easy as placing all of your boxes on the toe kick, and I start by placing my base cabinet and just go down the row. As you can see, the cabinets are all sitting nice and level across the entire length. Next, I like to attach all of those cabinets together prior to attaching them to the wall. This is a personal preference for me, and I find that it works quite well. I would also like to highlight that this isn't going to work in all situations, but in this example, it works fine. I like to line up the cabinets in the front, clamp them together, and then I'll always try to drill them together from the side that the screw will not be visible. It will not always work out this way, but here I have a bank of drawers, so nothing will be visible once the drawers are installed. And I always add screws to the front and the back. After I've attached all of my cabinets together, I will then mark all the stud locations on the actual cabinets for quick reference. I will follow the same shimming steps when attaching to the wall. And I don't typically attach to every single stud, again, because the cabinets are all attached together at this point. But I will try to attach them still in non-visible locations whenever possible. Now, in the event that you also would like to attach these cabinets to the base, this is where the T's and the L's come in handy, as you now have something to screw them into on the bottom. And that is how you can get rock-solid level cabinets. Thanks for watching.
What I have behind me is an upper cabinet on top of a built-in that I'm doing for my home office. And as you can see, I've got a nice little gap over here on the side. So the purpose of this video is I'm going to walk you through the steps on how I am going to scribe and fit the filler strip that will actually cover this area. Now here's a better view of what I'm trying to achieve. You'll see right here I already have one of my filler strips installed. And then the gap here is pretty much the same exact gap that we have here, just to make sure it looks uniformed on the way up. Now the other thing that I want to highlight is that these are full overlay frameless cabinets. So what I've actually done, and the way that I'll be doing these scribes, is these scribes will sit proud of the cabinet to give the look of inset across the entire built-in, like you see here. Now there's 3 measurements that I need to figure out right off the bat. I need to take a measurement at the bottom of the cabinet here. I want to take one at the top to the wall. And I also want to take a measurement from the surface all the way to the ceiling in this case, so I know how long my filler strip needs to be. The point that I am measuring is from the inside edge of the cabinet all the way out to the wall. And that measurement is 87 millimeters. Now my measurement at the top is 95. So we had 87 at the bottom, 95 at the top. And now to get my measurement all the way to the top, just so I don't have to worry about bending a tape measure, I'm going to use a laser to give me an exact measurement. So we have 87 millimeters at the bottom, 95 at the top, and a total length of 1,539. Now I'm using metric, you can use whatever you want. So this number stays the same. We know that that's a number that we have to cut exact. Now what we need to do is determine which of these 2 numbers is lower, which is obviously this, and that's going to be what we base cutting our strip off of. What I like to do is take that measurement and subtract 5 millimeters. So that's going to give me a measurement of 82 millimeters. So now I need something that's 82 millimeters wide by 1,539 millimeters long. Now next what I want to do is I want to make sure that this fits, in this instance, for the height. I want it to be nice and snug in there, and this actually fits perfectly. The next thing I'm looking at is I want to make sure that the edge of this is as close to flush with the inside of the cabinet. And in this instance, it's very tight. I don't need to secure this any other way because I got such a nice tight fit. So that's why you saw me using this mallet to knock this over and get everything nice and flush. So I'm going to try to move the camera on my own. So now you can see that I have a gap all the way up, and the gap gets bigger as it goes to the ceiling. And there, I'm nice and tight to the ceiling. So this actually worked out really, really well. Now what do we do with that gap, and why did I leave a gap in the filler strip? So this is why we left the gap, because we know that we're going to be moving this filler strip over the thickness of this side panel. So the gap over here does not matter as long as the gap is not wider than the thickness of this panel, if that makes sense. So the way that we're going to achieve that is I'm going to take a cut-off piece of material, same material that I'm using for the cabinet, and the smaller you can go, the better, because it makes less surface contact. And by having less surface contact, it's actually going to follow the curvature of the wall a lot better. And we're going to take this block and we're going to take a pencil and we're going to start at the top and we're just going to move our way all the way down, putting this piece of material against the wall and the pencil on the inside scribing that line. Before I move on to actually scribing, there is something that I did want to mention because I didn't really talk about that. In this case, I have a perfect friction fit. I just need this to stay steady while I scribe it. And right now this is not going to move. So now let's say that you didn't get as lucky as I did in this situation and it's cut a little bit short, or you're not going all the way to the ceiling and you can't pinch it in between 2 things. Well, I would just use blue painter's tape and some CA glue, and I would just hold it in place temporarily. And what's great about this combo is it doesn't destroy the wood or the material in any way. When you're done, you can just pop it right off. Now I'm going to scribe. And again, I said we want to remove this thickness So when we actually attach this and it's on the outside edge of the cabinet, it'll fill that space and be perfectly against the wall. So I'm going to take this block, go all the way to the top, and then I'm just going to run my pencil and that board all the way down, transferring the line. Now I'm going to cut this. Now I want to point something out. You could do this a lot of ways. You could use a jigsaw, you could use a table saw. That's not always going to be the best option if you're not comfortable freehanding a cut. But what I want to point out is that the distance from the line to the edge is wider there than it is here. So that eliminates pretty much the ability to use a fence. And the line is going to move and curve if your wall is out of square at all. My favorite way to do this, and that I feel like I get the best results, is with a track saw. And I'll explain why in just a moment. But what I'm doing right now is I'm putting my track on the material, and I am not putting it directly on the line. I'm actually going to leave it just a little bit proud of the line, and I'm going to use a sander to work my way back to the line. I like to use the track saw for two reasons. One, I know I can just put my track on the line, and the other one is I like to just create a quick back bevel. Now typically I will do a, say, 15 to 20 degree back bevel. In this case we'll do 15 degrees. Once I get it set at 15, I lock it in, and now I'm ready to make my cut. I left this cut a little bit further out than I typically would, just so you can get a better visual of what it is that I'm doing. So I need to work this material here off and get it to that line, because that line is the representation of the wall. And as you can see here with the back bevel, it's a lot less material that I have to remove, and it's going to be less surface area that touches the wall. So this is how you can get a lot tighter of scribes. Now this is one of my favorite uses for this sander, and that is using this small sander just to go ahead and trim that back. So let's go ahead and do a little section real quick. All I'm doing is just slowly working my way down to that line and continuing on all the way down. And once I get done, I can go test fit it. Now I like to do a quick test fit before actually installing it, just to make sure that it comes up against the wall the way that I was planning. Get this over. And taking a look, I'm very, very happy with how it's sitting right now. Now I've got it in place, and if I wanted to, I could just tack this thing in and be good to go. Now my situation's a little bit different because I need a backer, because I wanted this to be proud of the cabinet all the way across to give that inset look. So what you could do is just use glue and brad nails, glue and pin nails, whatever, go back, fill the holes later. There's multiple different ways that you can do this. Now the way that I'm about to show is by using the Lamello Tenso connectors. And what's great about these is that I can just put these in, pop it in place, and it stays, and I don't have to worry about it. And for whatever reason, if I ever needed to remove that strip for something, I could simply just pry it off and it would come off, and I would be able to clip it back in again later. Now I'm bringing that up because I know that the minute that people see these, they're gonna be like, I can't do this. And that's just an excuse, right? You can do everything I just showed you and attach it without using these. This is what I like to use, so that's why I'm using it. And also, I know a lot of you are curious on the value or the benefit to this system, and this will demonstrate that perfectly. These clips just slide in to these slots, and they snap in place to a corresponding receiver in the other piece of wood. All right, now it's the moment of truth. Just get these lined up. Just give you a quick run through. Nice and tight to the wall, all the way to the ceiling. And just like that, I have a perfectly scribed filler strip to the wall. And that is rock solid and not going anywhere. Hopefully you can see the value in a system like that for a job like this. It really has made this process a lot easier and a lot more enjoyable. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to do the same thing up at the top. Thanks. It's simply an instructional video to give you guys some pointers and some tips on how to go about assembling face frames. Here in this diagram, I've laid out just a few different things that we're going to focus on today. One being a drawer opening and the other one being the cabinet door opening. So for this face frame, we're going to have two vertical boards here and here, and then we're going to have three horizontal boards making the top, the bottom, and the separation for the drawer. The first thing that I want to figure out is what my opening is and what my overhang is going to be. And when I discuss opening and overhang, the opening is the distance from the outside edge of the cabinet to the other outside edge of the cabinet. That is the first measurement that I want to figure out. In this case, my measurement is 315 millimeters or approximately 12 3/8. The overhang that I'm referring to is how much that face frame is going to protrude past the outer wall being here. In most cases, when I'm building cabinets, I'll do anywhere from 1/8 of an inch to roughly 1/4 of an inch. For the face frame that I will be building for this cabinet today, the overhang will be 6 millimeters on each side, which is approximately 1/4 of an inch. Now coming back to the diagram, I know my opening is 315 millimeters, and I know my overhang on each side is going to be 6 millimeters. So 315 plus 12 millimeters is going to give me a total of 327 millimeters. The next measurement that I'm going to concern myself with is the overall height of my vertical boards. I am adding some overhang here, and the overhang that I'm referring to in this case is going to be slight overhang down at the bottom. As you can see here, I will have the same 6 millimeter overhang that will go down on the bottom. There are a lot of different techniques that you can use for this bottom piece here. We're not going to get into the details on that. And what I mean by a lot of different techniques is when you have your face frame on here, and you'll see it shortly, it could either be raised above, you could either have it flush, you could have it exactly the width of your piece of plywood, or you could have a large part protruding down on the bottom, kind of making your toe kick irrelevant. What I'm going to do today for this video is I'm simply going to have it overhang down on the bottom by about 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch, and then on the top it will be roughly the height of a piece of 3/4 inch plywood. Now, I know my height for the front of my cabinet, not including the toe kick, is 506 millimeters, or roughly 19 15/16. I'm going to add my 6 millimeters that will protrude below the bottom of the actual shelf itself, and that's going to give me a total of 512 millimeters. Now I have two measurements that are pertinent to what I'm getting ready to do. I went ahead and zoomed in here because I want to show you how I'm going to determine the width of my actual face frame boards themselves. So I know that I'm going to be overhanging 6 millimeters from the outside edge of this wall. I know that my plywood is 18 millimeters. So 18 plus 6 is going to give me 24 millimeters. Now, I plan on putting a drawer in this cabinet in this scenario. So I want to make sure that my face frame extends another 18 millimeters because I'm going to use a piece of 18 millimeter plywood as a backing to make sure that my drawer slides are perfectly flush with my face frame. And we'll talk more about that once we get into it. So 18 plus 18 equals 36, plus my 6 out on the side is going to give me 42. I am using metric. So some people may be looking at this going, this doesn't help me at all because it's metric. It doesn't matter. If you use metric or imperial, all I'm doing is showing you the steps on how to figure out how long your pieces need to be. I've gone ahead and moved the cabinet out of the way, and I've already actually cut my pieces for this face frame. So I have my 2 vertical pieces, as you see here, and then I have my 3 pieces that will be horizontal that will separate the 2 vertical pieces. In this video, the method of joinery that I'm going to use to construct this face frame is actually just going to be pocket screws. Typically, I will use the Festool domino for any of my face frame assemblies. However, I do understand that not everybody has a Festool domino, so today I'm going to show you how to do it with pocket holes with whatever machine that you have to create pocket holes. I'm not going to do a step-by-step instruction on exactly how to assemble it. It's fairly straightforward. This is one part that I want to highlight before I assemble this, and it's important to note how wide you need your opening to be for your drawer. So if you are building a drawer and the front of that drawer and the sides of that drawer are going to be 4 inches tall, you're going to need to make sure that you at least have, I would say, roughly 4 1/8 or 4 1/4, therefore giving you a little bit of gap on the bottom and a little bit of gap on the top. So that's the only part of this where you are actually going to have to measure to make sure that that opening is the way it needs to be. So I've assembled the face frame. So now the only thing left to do is go ahead and attach this. The way that I like to attach my face frames personally is I like to use glue and pin nails, and I use the pin nails in just a couple of spots really just to keep it in place until I'm able to get the clamps on it to allow the glue to dry. Now that I've tested it and I know everything fits the way that it should, I'll go ahead and put a small bead of glue and then I'll go ahead and get this thing assembled. So I've got everything pinned in place, so the next thing that I'll do is I'm going to grab some clamps and I'll clamp it from the front to the back just enough to let the glue dry and settle, and then my face frame is fully installed. Real quick, I just want to share a couple of different pointers that you can do, or a couple little tips when it comes to the face frames. In most cases, you're always going to have this overhang on the face frame, even when you're assembling cabinets side by side. When the cabinets are actually getting assembled together, what people end up doing is they put basically a spacer in here that will fill that gap, so when you screw the other cabinet into the other, it's not going to pull those cabinets in towards each other. You do have other options though. The other option that I have used in the past is to take a flush trim bit, and I always make my face frames a little bit oversized on specifically the vertical supports. Therefore, when I go and take my flush trim bit, I can cut it off, make everything uniformed, and then everything will be flush to the cabinet itself. Now, there is a downside to that. The downside is if there's any imperfections in your plywood, meaning your plywood slightly turns a little bit, then that is going to reflect in your face frame. And when you put 2 cabinets next to each other, that's when you're going to notice it. A lot of people ask me, how do you do drawer slides if you have a face frame and there's this space that's created here? It's really quite simple. When I was dealing with my measurements before, I said I wanted 18 millimeters to be inward from this wall here. And the reason I did that is because now I can take a piece of plywood and I can put that piece of plywood in my cabinet. Typically, I will cut them to be just slightly long or wider than the actual drawer slide itself. And now I can put this piece here and it is now flush with the face frame. So when I actually take my drawer slide, my drawer slide is now flush with the face frame, which in turn is going to make my drawer slide installation very, very simple. When it comes to the spacers for the drawer slides to ensure that the slide itself actually sits flush to the face frame. That's not necessarily your only option. They actually do make what's called L brackets that will click onto the back of your drawer slide, and it comes up and makes an L shape, and that L shape has a bunch of holes that can be screwed into the back wall. The type of material that you're using for the back wall obviously will make a difference on whether or not you can use those. The simple solution, if you're going to use face frames and still installing drawers and you have that gap, fill that gap with something, attach the drawer slide to it, and you'll be good to go. In this video, I'm going to go over a couple of different techniques that I take when I'm installing full extension drawer slides. That's the only type of drawer slide that we'll talk about in this video. But whether you're putting the drawer on the bottom and working your way up for multiple drawers, or you just want to install one drawer at the top, I'll show you a few tips and pointers that I found that have helped me over the past, and hopefully it will help you. Before we get into it, I'm going to go ahead and show you the different items that I'm going to be using and talking about in this video. So the first thing here, I have two 10-inch full extension drawer slides, which we'll talk a little more in detail. I've got a mini awl, which I will show you what I use that for. I've got my screws. I've got a spacer piece, which this will be used when we are installing just an upper drawer. I've got my favorite tool ever, the Incra Tiny T. I've got my Festool CXS drill. I'm using this drill because it's small and I need to get into tight spaces. I'll be using one of these DeWalt trigger style clamps. And then here I've got my drawer, which is literally just four sides. There is no bottom. The drawer is just for demonstration purposes in this video. All right, so when I'm getting ready to go do my drawers for whatever cabinet that I'm building, I found that there's three things that I always want to know right off the bat. And these are three important things that I wanted to highlight here. So the first thing is the width of the opening on your cabinet. Obviously, you need to know how wide your cabinet is. That way you can figure out how wide your drawers need to be. The next thing that's very important is the width of your drawer slides themselves. So you want to know how wide each one of these is, or the pair is. And the third thing you need to know is the width of the drawer material itself. And in this video, I'm using 3/4 inch plywood, which is actually 18mm plywood. So it's important that you know the thickness, because that's all going to come into play when it's time to make your drawers. Okay, so now to get in a little bit more detail what I was talking about. So the first thing that I mentioned is you want to know the width of your opening. So I'll go ahead and measure how wide 10 and 15/16, or 278 millimeters. You will hear me referring to this in both imperial and metric, because typically I use metric now. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. The second thing that I said is important to know is the width of your drawer slides. So here I have both of my drawer slides back to back, basically, because I just want to get one measurement for how wide these drawer slides are. So when I do my measurements, both of them together is 15/16, 23 millimeters. The third topic was the plywood itself. And you'll notice that I have two pieces here together of this 3/4 inch plywood. Reason being is because each one of these, if you refer back to my drawer making video, which I'll leave a card up in the corner for you if you haven't seen it, is these will act as the sides. So I need to know how thick these two are. And yes, I could just multiply the one measurement by two, but why not measure them both when you have the time? So this is 1 13/32, or 36 millimeters. So what I found works best now is you're going to take the opening, the measurement of the opening, you're going to subtract the measurement or the width of your slides, both slides. You're also going to subtract the width of both pieces of wood here, and that is going to give you the distance that you need for your front and back. And I'm going to show you an example of why I switched to metric and I find metric to be so much easier. Alexa, what is 10 and 15/16 minus 15/16?
10 multiplied by 1,516 equals 15,160.
She didn't let me finish. Alexa, what is 10 and 15/16 minus 15/16 minus 1 and 13/32?
This might answer your question. Minus 0.9375 minus 1 plus 1,330 seconds is 1,328.0625. Did that answer your question?
No, it didn't.
Thanks for your feedback.
It's so confusing. Now, let's try this. Alexa, what's 278 minus 23 minus 36?
The answer to your calculation is 219.
There you go. 219 millimeters. That's how long my piece needs to be. No 30 seconds, no 16ths, no eighths, no nothing. 219 millimeters. That's how long it's going to be. These are 10-inch full extension drawer slides. And what it means by full extension is that when you pull this out, it's extending the entire length of the drawer slide itself. So it will give you 10 inches. It'll make your drawer come 10 inches out of whatever cabinet you're building. How do you figure out what size drawer slide you need? Well, it's really quite simple. It's just however far you want that drawer to come out or however big you want that drawer, that's the size drawer slide that you need. For example, so these are 10-inch full extension drawer slides, like I just said. I made this drawer 10 inches in depth, and that was easy because I just cut my sides to be 10 inches. Now, this is a 10-inch full extension drawer slide. However, it is just under 10 inches in length. So however long your cabinet or however deep your cabinet drawer is going to be, that's what size full extension drawer slide you want if you want it to come out all the way. So to disassemble this into the two parts that it comes in, it's really quite easy. You're simply going to slide it, and when you slide it out, you'll see this little tab right here. Well, if you take that tab, let me go ahead and show you that again. If you take that tab and you press that down, just like that, this piece will slide out. Now, this is the piece that's going to go on your drawer itself. This is the piece that is going to go in the cabinet. The first drawer that I want to discuss is we're going to install a drawer on the bottom of the cabinet. And if this had multiple drawers, you would just work your way up. I found that's the easiest way. So all you're going to do is you're going to place this drawer slide in. I actually like to make it so the edge of my drawer slide is pretty much flush with the wood itself. I might catch some flack for that because I've seen a lot of people say that you want to have it set ever so slightly back. Not really sure the reason. I found that by having it flush, it works just as good. My drawer is still inset ever so slightly to where when I go and put my face frame on, it's tight up against the frame itself and not sticking out. I'd rather have it a little further back than too far out. If you're unable to get it in the exact spot that you want, luckily, the back of these drawer slides have holes that you can use that will allow you to slide it forward and back. So if I was to use this hole for my screw, obviously I don't have as much play as if I was able, or if I was to use one of these elongated holes where I could slide it front and back in order to ensure that my door is perfectly flush against the cabinet frame itself. If I'm doing a bottom drawer, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use this bottom shelf right here as my template. So I'm gonna just place my drawer slide so I know it's laying down flat on the base here, and that's where I'm gonna go ahead and drill it into place. We have to put this on the drawer itself. So how do I actually figure out exactly where on the drawer I need it to go? Well, I'm gonna show you that here now. You see the center of the slot where you're actually gonna put the screw. And if you can see it clearly, you'll see that it's roughly 28-30 seconds to the center of that slot. That's a good place to start, but what I like to do is take it to the bottom of that line where you can see here is 24-30 seconds. So I'm taking about 1/8 of an inch off. Why am I gonna take 1/8 of an inch off? Well, the reason is because if I was to do it perfectly on that center line, when I have my drawer slide in, this will be exactly the distance from this bottom board here to where this is going in. So what that means is when I push this in, it's gonna be scraping the bottom of the shelf, and I don't want that. By basically going 1/8 of an inch down on the drawer slide itself, it's going down further on the drawer, therefore the drawer, when I put it in, will be raised. So now to further illustrate this, and hopefully this will make more sense, is I've got all of my measurements here on my tiny T,
And remember we said 28/32 is where the center line of the slide itself is, and we wanted to drop down to 24. So I'm going to use that 24 and I'm going to scribe a line. This is now the center line of the portion here that I need to put on my drawer itself to go into the drawer slide. This is where I like to use my awl, and there's a couple of things that I want to do. So you want to make sure that this is flush with the edge. So you could just try to use your finger and hold it in place, but what I found, just take a straight board and line it up on the end, slide your drawer slide forward. You make sure that that line is as close to center as possible, and then I'm going to use my awl to mark where I want my screw to start. Here, just like on the slides themselves, you have 3 different holes you can use. So this is a more permanently fixed one. This one would make it so you can move up and down, and then this one would make it so you can move front or back. Early on, I would sometimes use these screw holes in an effort to correct any mistakes that I made. But however, now that I've done it quite a few times, I feel pretty comfortable using the more permanent holes. And so I'm just going to mark in the center there, and then in the back, I'm going to mark where I want my screw to go in the back hole. So now we're ready to go ahead and attach the slide itself to the side of the drawer. And the screws that I like to use are these 5/8 inch screws that you can buy, or that usually will come with the slides. Obviously the length of your screw would depend on the thickness of your material. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to screw in the first screw, but I'm not going to screw it all the way in. I want it to be a little bit loose because that will allow me to manipulate the slide itself to get it in the perfect position. Once I've gotten it to the position that I want it to be, I'll go ahead and screw in my rear screw all the way. And then I will go back, make sure that everything is still lined up, and I will install the second screw. Now obviously you're going to flip this over and you're going to do the same thing on the other side. Just make sure that you identify where the front of the drawer is, because you want your slide obviously to be the same on the opposite side. The only other step left is to go ahead and install my drawer slides on the bottom of each side. I find that by having the drawer slides out, when you're going to slide these rails into it, being able to depress the slides just a little bit in order to get it to go back smooth works very well. Something I want to point out is that when you start to push these back for the first time, what'll end up happening a lot of times is it'll be hard to push back. And the reason why it's hard to push back is because it's like setting the slides. So once you get it in and you push it, then it should be good to go and slide freely, just like that. Here I just wanted to bring it in for a closer look. You have this gap down here at the bottom, and it's nice and even all the way across, almost about 1/8 of an inch. So that's important that you have that because you just don't want the bottom of this drawer sliding on the wood itself. All right, so now if you wanted to continue your drawers up the way, then all you would have to do is you can just cut spacers like this, set it on top of that drawer slide. This spacer now references off the drawer slide itself, and then you would just simply set your next drawer slide on top of that. Okay, so now let's say that I want to go ahead and just install one drawer, and I want that drawer to be right up at the top. So the way I'm going to do that is fairly similar to the last method that I used. I'm going to measure my opening, which is 18.5. I know that the height of my drawer itself is 6 inches. So by doing simple math, if I come down 6 inches, then my drawer would approximately be right here. But remember, I do want to have about 1/8 of an inch right up here so that my drawer, with the same principle as I'm pushing it in, is not scraping along this part of the support. What can I do? I can make a spacer block here that I will place inside of my cabinet like this, and then I will install my drawer slide directly on top of this support. Now, the measurement that I'm using for this, because I had 12.5 inches remaining, I made this 12 3/8 because I want it to come down ever so slightly to give me that gap. And to ensure that this stays in place, I'm just gonna go ahead and use one of these clamps because I just want it to stay steady and not move while I'm installing my drawer slide. Got my drawer in place. I've got a nice little gap along the top and everything looks good, looks pretty even. And that is how you would install a top drawer.
And the cabinet doors that I built are these simple shaker style cabinet doors. If you're unfamiliar with how to build these cabinet doors, I'll go ahead and put a link in the YouTube card so you can check out my video on how to make shaker style doors for your cabinets. But today we're talking about specifically installing the hinges and putting them onto the face frame. So let's go ahead and get started. Here's a closer shot of the cabinet. As you can see, I've got this face frame on it, and the one that we're gonna be working on today is gonna be the door that goes over this left side. This cabinet face frame is constructed of 3/4 inch poplar. Now, I wanted to make sure that it's exactly 3/4 of an inch because that's gonna come into play with the style hinges that I'm using. There's multiple different styles of hinges that you can use, but for the face frame application, the ones that I like to use the best are these 3/4 inch overlay hinges from Rockler. They're soft close, they have 110 degrees of opening, and they're really, really easy to use. The other benefit to it is that you can go online or at the store and you can actually print off the specifications of these, and I just think it's a nice addition. And one of the reasons why I think that's so important is because of one of the measurements that I'm going to talk about here shortly. I've got my door here and it's turned sideways because this is the area right here that I'm actually going to be installing the hinges on. Now, there's two measurements that I'm concerned about when I'm doing this. And the first one is where I'm gonna put these hinges. And I'll figure that out in just a moment. The second is what's called the tab. And the tab is the distance from the hinge itself, meaning this bottom portion here, from this outside line to the edge of the wood. And that is gonna be very important when it comes to how much your overlay is. Overlay being however much it's sticking out over the front of the face frame, whether it's 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch. This case is gonna be 3/4 of an inch. So those are the two measurements that I'm concerned about. One of the great things that I mentioned about having this document is if you look down here, that distance, the tab, is only 3 millimeters, and that'll be important here in just a moment. So the total height of this door is 17.5 inches. To make things easy, all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come 4 inches from each end, and that's going to be the center of my hinge. So I've got 4 inches here, and 4 inches here. Now that's 4 inches from each one of the ends, just so they're equally spaced. Then I'm just gonna extend that line, just so I have a reference. And now I know where my hinges are gonna be placed. The tool that I find really, really helpful when installing the hinges is another tool from Rockler. And you can buy this there, it's not very expensive. And the thing that I like about it is that it has the different tab settings listed. So you got 3, 5, 4, 11, and then if you're doing variable and you need to slide it and move it quickly, you can use those. So these are already set to a tab of 3. It also comes with this Forstner bit and this guide, which I'll show you how that operates in just a moment. Very simple to use. You can open up the clamp right there. You basically slide it onto your workpiece. There's a line right here that I'm just gonna align with the line that I made. Once I have it, I'm just gonna tighten this down and it won't move. It'll stay on there nice and tight. And then all you have to do from there is take the head unit, place this down and drill down in. And there's a depth setting on this, so you actually can adjust it to the depth that you want it to go and drill away. Full disclosure, the depth setting on this thing is actually kind of a pain in the butt to get adjusted exactly the way you want it. Mine is already set because I use those hinges quite often. So I'm not gonna mess it up and check it out, but something that I always do is I practice on a test piece first just to make sure that the depth for the hinge is correct. You can use any piece of scrap wood you really want. All I'm doing is just testing to make sure that the depth is going to be correct. So we'll go ahead and give it a try. Looks like it needs to go just ever so slightly deeper. So I'll make that adjustment and do it again. After some quick adjustments, perfectly flush. Now that I did my test piece, I'm ready to go ahead and drill my 2 actual holes for my door. Now that I've got everything cut, I've got my hinge laid into the door frame itself, I'm gonna go ahead and get these installed. And one of the things that I find really, really useful in this application is one of these Woodpecker's mini squares. It's just great. I just put it right up against the edge so I can make sure that the edge of this is square. Once I have everything in place, I insert my first screw. Put in my second. Make sure they're tight. Still square. And then I move on to my second. So here's a technique that I like to use. It's really easy, really quick. It's not rocket science, but it just works for me. And I'm gonna share what that is. So I know I'm using 3/4 inch overlay doors. Now I wanted it to be 3/4 of an inch everywhere, top, bottom, and sides. So I come up to the top here and I'm gonna find 3/4 of an inch and I'm gonna mark it. Then I'm gonna take that line. Now I'm going to extend it out. So now I have a line at 3/4 of an inch. Now the reason that I did that line is because now I can use that line to reference the top of my door to get it in a rough area that I need it to be. Once I've gotten it in that rough area, then I'm going to put this screw in dead center because it does have the ability to make adjustments. I'm going to tighten it down almost all the way. And now that line is equal with the top of my door. That screw is in the center for in the event that I do need to adjust it. And now I'm just going to put on the bottom screw. Now that I have this installed, I'll just go over briefly what some of the different adjustments that you can make are. The screw that you see here in the middle, that's used to adjust the door up and down if you need to, which again, I made that line just to use it as a reference to get close to it, and then I put the screw in the center of that slot, so it gives me the option to move up and down if I need to, and in this case, I don't. So this screw here is gonna be your depth adjustment. And turning the screw is gonna move the door inward or outward and basically adjust. I'll turn it a little bit. It's gonna adjust how far away it's gonna sit from the door once it's closed or even when it's open, but you can fine tune that. And then in the front here, this one's used to move the door left and right. And by turning it the different directions, once you have your other door, if I needed to shift over just slightly to get the correct spacing between doors, I can use that. And then these switches right here, these are not on all of them. These are only gonna be on soft close hinges. I can either turn the soft close on or off. Right now it's on, obviously. And if I decided I didn't want the soft close feature, I just push it down like so. Easy way to do it. So today I'm gonna show you just how you can make those shaker style doors if all you have is just a table saw. So to make these shaker style doors, you're gonna need a few things. First thing you're gonna need is your stiles. Stiles are the side pieces that run vertically. The rails, which run horizontally on the top and bottom, and then you're gonna need whatever material you're gonna use for your panel. So for this demonstration, this is simply a demonstration video. I'm only going to use pine for my stiles and rails from some scraps I had laying around, and then I'm gonna use 1/4 inch MDF. And typically this is actually, if I'm gonna make a shaker style door, this is actually what I tend to use the most. I just like it, it's a good material and it paints very well. I like my material to be 3/4 of an inch thick when I'm working with these type of doors. Typically, that is the only thickness that I use. So what I want is 3/4 of an inch so I know that I can have 1/4 of an inch down in the center and then I'll have 1/4 inch remaining on each side. So the first thing I like to do is start with the stiles. The stiles, I want to determine how tall it's going to be. So if my door is going to be 20 inches tall, I cut my stiles to 20 inches. Then I take into consideration the width that I want each side. Typically, I will usually cut my door panels to 2.5 inches on each side. So you got 2.5 inches here, 2.5 inches here, making 5 inches. Now, when we're talking about the width, it's important to take into consideration the amount of wood that is going to go into the stile itself from the rail. In this case, it's going to be 3/8 of an inch on each end. And if you notice, I've already got it marked 3/8 of an inch on each end, the part that's going to be cut. That's an important consideration because when you cut that part off and you slide it into the stile itself, you're essentially taking 3/4 of an inch off of this total distance. So whenever you cut your rails, always make them whatever the additional length is that's actually going to go into the boards itself. For these stiles, there will be a groove that is cut all the way down that is 3/8 of an inch deep. When I go to determine the size of my panel, I want to make sure that it's the same width as my rails. Because after we cut off these pieces on the ends that are going to slide into the stiles here, we want to make sure that there's a portion of it left on the panel to also do the same thing and slide in to the stiles. In terms of how much it's going to go in the top and bottom, same rule applies as down here. So we want to make sure that this goes 3/8 of an inch into this. We want to make sure it goes 3/8 of an inch into the top. So we're basically going to take whatever this measurement is here, the internal measurement from the top of this rail to the bottom of this rail, whatever this measurement is here, and we're going to add 3/4 of an inch. That way, it will ensure that once we close up the frame, it goes around the edges of this panel. So now that we have all the boring stuff out of the way, let's move over to the table saw and start making cuts. Now that I know my blade is 3/8 of an inch high, it's time for me to go ahead and cut the grooves on the stiles and rails in order to accept the panel. So what I'm going to do, I started off with 3/4 inch material. So I know that I need to set my fence 1/4 of an inch away from the blade. And when I cut my stiles and rails, I know that I'll have 1/4 inch left over on each side. So now that we have the grooves cut and the stiles and rails, it's time to go ahead and take off that end portion so therefore it can fit into the stiles and we can go ahead and start assembling our cabinet door. Now that we've made all the cuts, it's time to go ahead and start putting it together. All right, everybody, so there it is, shaker style door. As you can see in the video, very simple to do, very quick. If you're looking to make some sort of cabinet style door for whether it's a cabinet or a built-in or whatever you have in the house and you like the design, the very simple design of a shaker style door, I urge you to give that a try and you'll find that it's very easy. It is not intimidating at all. And from there you can go into other different types of doors. You can even run this through a router table to round off the edges, or you can just take some sandpaper and cut the edges up to make them nice and smooth so they're not so sharp if that's the look that you prefer. Again, very easy to do and very cost effective.